a lot of our systems from an economic standpoint are failing. We have multiple crises going on at the same time, and so much that is putting pressures on our workforce that are unsustainable. We're seeing more people opt to quit. We're seeing Gen Zs who are going to make up 30% of the workforce radically opposing the way that we think about work. And so we need to be thinking very differently about sustainability and the part that humans play in the workforce and what we really want to achieve. And we need to be thinking very differently about what we want to see from a sustainable economic strategy that doesn't look to GDP as the main measure of success.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. The evidence suggests that there is a burnout epidemic underway. And although the COVID crisis may have made it more acute, it was pre-existing. Building great experiences of work starts first with the basics, dealing with the underlying issues that cause chronic stress. Author and international speaker Jennifer Moss is on a mission to dispel the myths surrounding burnout, happiness, and company productivity in order to foster a thriving workplace for both companies and employees. Jennifer's an award-winning writer and international speaker on future-focused leadership development. Her past clients include Fortune 500 companies such as Google, Deloitte, and KraftHeinz. Her latest book, The Burnout Epidemic, lays out the root causes of burnout and provides simple, research-based solutions for helping employees minimize stress and build happier workplaces. In this episode, Jennifer and I discuss the continuum from happiness to burnout, future workforce shifts and their potential economic impact, the 6 root causes of burnout, and how the idea of happiness has changed throughout history. We also talk about the greatest misconceptions regarding burnout, the disconnect between engagement and well-being at work, and other topics. All right, if you enjoy this episode, do subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now I bring you my conversation with Jennifer Moss. Jennifer Moss, welcome to Work for Humans.
I'm thrilled to be here. I can't wait to have this conversation, Dart.
So you have 2 books, and I know that you're working on a third. The most recent one is The Burnout Epidemic. And I want to do the subtitles on both of these because I think they're both important. The subtitle there is The Rise of Chronic Stress and How We Can Fix It. Your first book is Unlocking Happiness at Work. And the full title there is How a Data-Driven Happiness Strategy Fuels Purpose, Passion, and Performance. We had Christina Maslach on the show. And so we've had a show that was around burnout, and you have some different takes on it, which I want to get into. But I really want to talk about the continuum, and I think it's not a continuum, from happiness to burnout. And is the opposite of burnout happiness? When you were writing this, did you find that you were kind of writing the anti-book of the happiness book, or was it different? So let's talk about what you learned there.
I love that you asked that because I do think that there was a level of cynicism that I was feeling as I was starting to write more around burnout, because the work that I was doing around unlocking happiness at work and what led to that book was a startup that I co-founded in 2012, and we were looking at gathering insights on what makes people happy at work. And it started very simply with just asking people what made them smile that day or sharing a happy feeling that day. And we were really, I think, in the early stages, this was way before Calm and some of these other technologies were coming in as a workplace tool to think about well-being and wellness at work. And so we came at it from a very simple perspective, but at that time, there was so much desire to bring positivity into our values at work. And we created, I think, and I was part of the problem, was this toxic positivity where we weren't dealing with a lot of the real underpinnings of why people weren't happy. And so we're coming in and we do know that mindset plays a big role. I mean, there's tons of research around with Martin Seligman, for example, and Adam Grant and others that talk about this ability for us to be able to increase our pro-social behaviors, which leads to better outcomes for our lives, for the happiness of people around us. But when organizations took it over, it was like, here, let's just downstream Band-Aid tactic, like a program around happiness and well-being. And we still see that today. And so when I was researching the burnout epidemic and even just my own experiences working with organizations that were trying to solve a problem in this silver bullet way without really looking at the institutional stressors that they were contributing to, that's what led me to focus more on how do we look at this upstream and reduce chronic stress and burnout and those institutional stressors so that then we can optimize with those well-being programs because people are energized and they don't feel like it's tone deaf and they actually can use it because they're not completely depleted and burned out.
I like that phrase, toxic positivity, which is if you don't fix the fundamentals, you're not going to get to a place where you can focus on the positives. And that there's a kind of gaslighting that goes on when people are saying, be happy, or, here's a snack or whatever it is they decide is going to be the thing. You spoke a lot about the motivation hygiene theory by Frederick Herzberg. Can you describe that for us?
This, for me, was an aha moment in my research when I was looking through what is the real problem that we're trying to solve. And what I found across the organizations that we were working with, and it wasn't even that they were aware of it and it was intentionally that they were ignoring it. It's just the burnout research, even though Christina has been working on it for a very long time, it was still pretty novel. And the WHO had only really announced burnout as institutional stress in 2019. So it was pretty novel. But there was a lot in those root causes of burnout that demonstrated just a lack of corporate hygiene as the root cause of these problems. And that's, these simple table stakes stuff like equal pay and making sure that people feel recognized for their work, that there's a value in what they do, that they aren't overworking. They're not chronically overworking because there's massive physical and catastrophic implications to that. And feeling that you have a sense of fairness and justice at work. These are hygiene expectations. And if we don't have those met, we cannot optimize. We cannot increase engagement because these two kind of motivation and hygiene are not on this continuum. We need to get hygiene managed and taken care of, and then we can motivate. And what's happening and what happens with toxic positivity is that we go right to motivation and we're not actually looking at fixing the hygiene. And it can take a long time to get that right. But when we do, then you see those organizations highly optimized and happy.
You mentioned two of them. I'm going to mention a couple of others of the things that you described Herzberg talking about. In terms of what are hygiene? Paying people what they're worth and on time. I like the on time part. That's pretty table stakey to me.
Yeah.
People feel mentally safe. I know what my job is. So I'm not like lost and trying to figure out how to contribute. Access to tools and resources. Now, you went a lot farther in your book in terms of what causes burnout. Before I get into that, though, which book was more fun to write?
It's interesting because I loved writing Unhappiness at Work in that it was motivational and it felt really good. And I do think that, I tried to write it so it's not tone deaf. People are going to read it and not think, oh, it's just, let's practice gratitude every day and we're going to solve systemic discrimination. I definitely don't feel like it's too tone deaf, but I would say that the burnout epidemic, it felt like I had this massive amount of passion behind it because I was so connected to it personally. I felt like I was layered into the research. It wasn't just me talking over here as an academic looking at it or as an expert, a practitioner giving counsel. I had gone through my own experience of burnout and I realized so much of myself in the book. But I did write it pre-pandemic and into the pandemic. And so I had to scrap a lot of the words I had written pre-pandemic because everything had changed. And that was when I was homeschooling 3 kids and juggling having a husband at home. And I had to write the book inside of my bedroom. And highly ironic writing a book on burnout in the middle of a global pandemic. So there was parts of it that I think really are why I loved writing it. And then there's aspects where I think I'd never want to do that again.
But had you experienced burnout before the pandemic? It was a pre-pandemic experience?
It was, and I think a lot of people in my role can understand this. Anyone that's an entrepreneur, anyone that's starting up a company. I mean, you would know in the world of Silicon Valley how much stress it is. And as a female co-founder, this was in a time in Canada still where there wasn't a lot of support. There still isn't a lot of support for women starting up tech companies. And so we were battling for funding all the time. And you're trying to birth an idea that you're so connected and married to. And we were really ahead of our time. Since then, there's been so many organizations that have come into this space. And at the time, there was a lot of eye rolls about happiness at work and actually being beneficial for business. I mean, CFOs would just look at us like, yeah, that's not happening. And so I love seeing that now. But in that time, it was debilitating, it was demoralizing. And we had the benefit of going from a startup to a stay up. We lasted, 6 years. So that's a pretty big feat. And we ended up, incubating inside of a company so it was a good success story in the end, but it was painful. And as a woman too in that space, I felt a lot of expectation to be on boards, to represent women in tech, to make sure that women felt empowered, that my story was going to be a good story so people could follow in that path, that they could see female leadership. And so I had to kind of disguise how I was feeling a lot of the time. And that led to my burnout. And that's where that institutional stress, and you see that layered on women and why women are more likely to burn out than their male counterparts, is this extra layer of performative behaviors and feeling a responsibility to be a leader. And it can be soul crushing at times, and you forget to take care of yourself.
My experience with burnout was it felt, in retrospect, like I was taking drugs, bad drugs, which is probably exactly what it is. It's just that they're self-generated. But it felt like, I don't know, some kind of like something that makes you dumb and unhappy at the same time. I don't know what it was.
I really appreciate what you just said, because something that I talk a lot about right now, it happens with burnout and chronic stress, and you see it in the brains of women in menopause and postpartum, is brain fog. And the brain fog piece is for high performing people and people that are used to be able to be productive and effective. It can really impact your confidence when you're struggling to find your words, when you're making more mistakes, where you're feeling like you just can't focus and you can't get work done at the same level that you expect. And those people tend to be perfectionists. So they also are at risk of burnout. So you have brain fog, perfectionists, this sort of obsessive behavior around everything being perfect, and it's an all or nothing thinking. I've seen people leave professions like physicians leaving their life's work, and CEOs after 23 years dropping out of their companies. And I think that that is something we need to address so people can say, yeah, it's not me, it's the burnout.
So that's brain fog. I did not know what that was, that thing of feeling like you're on drugs. Well, this was combined. It's like brain fog plus being roasted on a spit over a fire. It's not fun.
It's not.
So, what are some of the greatest misconceptions about burnout? And what were your misconceptions that you might have revised while you were writing the book?
One of the things that I find is a big myth is that we look at burnout, or we misdiagnose burnout as underperformance. And I call it the underperformer myth. And when you look at what we see when someone is underperforming, they almost layer on directly to the symptoms of burnout. They're coming in late, they're leaving early, they're calling in sick more, and they're making mistakes that they used to not make. They're disengaged. All of these types of behaviors, we look at that person and we don't recognize that they were once a very passionate, engaged employee that we spend a whole bunch of money attracting and retaining and bringing them into the fold. And here they are, just for some unknown reason, they're underperforming. They're just like on a path now. They're actively disengaged. We need to move them out. We need to put them on an exit strategy to move them out of the organization, some sort of plan. And you see that a lot instead of going, okay, how did some of these institutional pressures actually increase their chronic stress and burnout? Which, if I mediate those, I mean, you want to mitigate them in the first place, be preventative. But if we're already there, let's look at solving for some of that stuff because we'll probably get that high performer back. We've burned them out. So instead of just assuming that they aren't passionate about their job anymore, we need to reintroduce that through prevention methods. And so that is something that I think is a big myth. And a lot of managers just make assumptions because we're busy and we're stretched and managers and leaders are burned out too. And we're not really able to see it as clearly. But start to look through what that is and is happening with someone and have those conversations because we lose some really talented people. And then they go to other organizations that have stronger concepts of well-being, better hygiene, and then they flourish. And we're like, we've lost those people to these competitors that now have figured out what the whole sort of the way for us to be thinking about well-being, they're doing it right. And if we just did that in the first place, we wouldn't have lost some really great talented people.
This raises a point that came up that I'd like to unpack for myself here. The thing about reading Herzberg is that you constantly get the feeling that what he's interested in is productivity. And so what you get is, I want you to be happy, I want you to be motivated because I'll get more out of you. And if you could be productive without being happy, I'd be fine with that. That's what I get reading Herzberg. And a lot of the early IO psych people, that's what I get. That's a problem to me because if somebody comes to you and says, I want you to be happy so that you'll do more for me, it's a completely different message. But what you just said is almost the flip side of that, is that when someone is having performance challenges, to have a sense that it may be environmental and to have the ability, a culture of forgiveness for that and understanding. And so these are like two pieces that I haven't put together yet because I hadn't thought about what you just said. But I wonder if you could help me to unpack that. I guess the first thing is the problem that I've experienced with Herzberg.
I think from a cultural nuance, we have to think of Herzberg being a product of his generation at the time. And he was also pretty highly cynical, working in the middle of New York in hospice and working with substance users and realizing there was, in this environment, there was just a lot of very stressed out consumers of him and the kind of the service that he was providing at the time. So I think his personality was a bit jaded, which I think is interesting because he does look to Maslow, who was his mentor, as thinking about what are those needs, what are the needs assessment, and that at work, we still need our basic needs met, or we can't hit that. I know it's not a pyramid, but the next level. So he understood that, but I also think too that he was trying to communicate, and I think that's why I really sort of fell in love with his theory, is that so much of what I had to communicate to leaders in organizations is, for them, they didn't want to hear about how it was human-centered and why it's good for people for us to do this way and why it's better for a global community to have people happier and well. They want to know that this investment that they're making actually is going to equal to improved sales, revenue, shareholder value, impact. And that's why I think Sean Akers' work around this, really looking at, and Sonia Lieber-Morsky and others, where they've really tied metrics of success to well people. And so what I come to it sort of in the same vein, but from a different direction, is that we have to look at this as, from a financial standpoint, if you just let your high performers go and not mitigating by thinking about well-being as the solution, then you're doing it all in the wrong way. And so I think from who you're communicating to and what matters to certain groups, you can say it both ways. There's some leaders, and I see leaders out there, very passionate leaders who actually really do care. And you see that a lot about their employees and want them to be happy. And they know it's important. And they see that the byproduct of conscious capitalism is actually that the downstream impact of all those great metrics. But for them, it's at the heart of just being a good leader and doing good by their people. So I think you need to speak in both languages, in both Herzberg's way of thinking about it from a productivity standpoint, because then people get it. And then also to those passionate leaders who know that that's just the human-centered approach to being a good human. And that matters to some. Unfortunately, it doesn't matter as much to all. And that's why you see some of the desire for employees right now or for employers, they kind of like the idea of a recession because then employees don't have the same control over these types of initiatives like flexibility and work-life balance and well-being. They get to claw that back. We were giving people all the flexibility and now it's coming to the office 5 days a week because, I want to have more productivity. So I think, unfortunately, there's a large subset of those senior leaders and executives and employers that don't care as much about the employee happiness piece as I would like to see.
Yeah, a part of what I think with Herzberg is that we know about Herzberg because he had a way of framing it that was attractive to leaders. And so his work has replicated. A part of my concern in reading Herzberg is that you can think about productivity once, but then you need to stop thinking about it in terms of the execution of what you do. Because it has to be after that one moment where you say, well, people will be more productive if they're happy. Okay, then forget that. Let's work on happiness so that it's not all shot through with, so I can get more out of you.
I couldn't agree with you more. And in the new book, I'm spending quite a bit of time talking about polycrisis and the fact that we are now in a state where a lot of our systems from an economic standpoint are failing. I say it's kind of like right now, it's like stretched taffy and everything in the middle is kind of falling through from the fact that we have multiple crises going on at the same time and so much that is putting pressures on our workforce that are unsustainable. And what a lot of economists fear, and you're hearing this come up now at the World Economic Forum, the WHO and UN talking about the fact that it could be a long period of time where we're constantly in the state of it not just being a global pandemic, but war and political stressors that just constantly kind of in our face, reminding us that things are unstable in the world and we feel a sense of instability. And all of that pressure is making us feel like we need to behave as a workforce much differently. And that means we're not working as many hours. When you look at the data around young male, highly educated, the highest earner males are actually reducing their hours per year by 10%, which is a very unbelievable data point when you look across history. We see women executives, the pipeline narrowing because they are finding different solutions for not feeling like they can actually hit those goals in their career. We're seeing more people opt to quit versus stay in jobs that are in the office 5 days a week. We're seeing Gen Zs who are going to make up 30% of the workforce radically opposing the way that we think about work. And so we see GDP flattening, productivity is this big measure. We see it flattening. And yet, when you think from 1950, we've actually increased our productivity by 430%. So we keep having this bar around GDP as this measure, this thing that we're focusing on. Productivity as the end all be all goal. And that's going to collapse our economic framework. And so we need to be thinking very differently about sustainability and the part that humans play in the workforce and what we really want to achieve. And innovate or die credos need to be abandoned.
We need to be thinking very differently about what we want to see from a sustainable economic progress strategy that doesn't look to GDP as the main measure of success.
One of the people who came on the show was Bill Hurst. He's a Cambridge political scientist. And one of the things we talked about is how if you optimize any system for one outcome, it comes at the cost of other outcomes. And ultimately, it may come at the cost of the thing you're optimizing for. Because complex systems, they feed themselves from a lot of different stakeholder perspectives. That's a really complicated way. It's a much more complicated way to say what you just said. Your way is better. But basically, this idea that anchoring entirely on GDP could have the reverse effect.
I find all of this so fascinating because I've always talked about engagement being a false measure. You can measure engagement and people can be highly engaged, but they can be extremely unwell. So this idea of measuring engagement as like part of happiness, I don't see that. And I know Maslow talks about the antithesis of burnout is engagement. And I actually don't agree with that. I think that I've seen this in the data that we've gathered is that, especially we looked at 12,000 teachers in one group and we looked at how engaged these teachers were because they show up the way we measure it, the way they show up to work, how they don't call in sick, they're not late, they're there by the bell and they leave at the bell and they're doing all this extra work, but they were extremely unwell and had very low job satisfaction and their prediction of leaving their jobs within 3 months was so high. And yet we would look at engagement as this measure. The same thing with GDP and productivity. We lose all the other parts of what's underneath that is propping up GDP and propping up productivity that could be a tsunami waiting to happen where there is, like I said, that middle part where things just break apart and everything falls through. And so we need to build different infrastructures and different measures so that we can really understand how do we look at engagement, but also the well-being index and look at putting some of these measures together. How do we look at GDP and kind of World Poll Gallup data around happy countries and happy cities and humans? Thinking of different ways of creating nuance to measures now, I think is one of the biggest shifts we need to make, but it's so institutionalized. It's very difficult for people to rethink capitalism and rethink the way that we've been behaving. I mean, when you look at the scientific revolution, it was 500 years ago. We've been in this pattern for 500 years, and it's at a time where it makes sense it could be breaking. I mean, this is a long historical pattern that we've been on. So I think that we're seeing a breaking point right now that we have the opportunity to prevent, but we're not really doing a good job of addressing its urgency.
I want to get into the causes of burnout. But before that, I have a question on happiness, which should have been earlier in the conversation. In the history of happiness, has our idea of happiness changed? And I ask it because you have such a large section of that book that is about historical perspectives on happiness. Well, put it this way. Historical speakers on happiness, I don't know if they represent a trend.
Yeah, you know, that part, you're kind of looking at the history of happiness and how from the philosophers and how it went all the way through various scientists and psychologists and people just thinking about happiness over the years. And I think what I've found in the last maybe 5 years or so, more of this focus on contentment versus maybe the last decade, but focus on contentment versus happiness. And, happiness is very fleeting. And I think we talk about that as some sort of goal of achieving happiness. We all want to feel happy all the time. Unless we feel happy all of the time, then we failed. And I think that a lot of what's happened in the last, I say 10, but maybe even more of 15, 20 around emotional intelligence and psychological fitness and how we can feel a multitude of emotions and feeling sad, in the continuum of being happy is actually more likely to make us happier and recognizing that, like moving away from toxic positivity of an expectation for this to be a permanent state versus a sense of contentment where we are okay to have a year that's terrible, or 3 years with the pandemic that was really difficult. But two things can be true at the same time. And so for me, for example, I use this sort of dialectical theory, that idea of opposites. But I felt like it was really difficult to have so many people in the house as I'm trying to write my book, and it was exhausting. And we adopted a pandemic puppy, which was absolutely stupid. I don't know why we did that. I love her, but that was stupid. There's just a bunch of things that I felt so overwhelmed by, the distractions in the house, and feeling like in the middle of writing my book, I'm still supposed to get up and fix whatever is broken or put dishes in the dishwasher, which I would have never felt like if I didn't have all this chaos. And yet, at the same time, I love that we weren't dividing and conquering constantly, where kids weren't in every single sport that we, were always apart from each other, where I was traveling, my husband was traveling, we never saw each other. We were in this situation where we were forced to get very clear about what our priorities were. We were at that Maslow survival state, on a day-to-day basis and in our minds for a lot of people. And so that around happiness in this last few years has really clarified for me this idea that we need to sit in two places to really be happy and to accept these two places that we're in consistently. And when we get better at doing that, Tal Ben-Shahar talks a lot about that, we can actually at that point achieve post-traumatic growth and achieve an increase in our happiness set points, which most of us stay pretty consistent through our lives. But if we want to push through a happiness set point and hit another level of contentment or happiness, we have to actually have struggle, and we have to have pain, and we have to go through some of the things we want to avoid in order to be happy. And so I think realizing that you need to actually go through that to be happy has been, I think, in research and just in my own anecdotal experience and learning, is the true way to get to a higher level of happiness.
That's one of the things I really appreciated in your first book was essentially the complexifying of happiness, which is we have, as you pointed out, a very simple idea of happiness. And I have to say, I feel like it's very tied to the fact that our words are not very good at talking about it. And that the idea that the word happiness is way too simple for what is possible. But I really appreciated just the idea of, wait a second, before we talk about happiness, let's take a stand back and actually ask ourselves, what is all of it? It was a really good read to go through that.
Thank you. For me, writing it came out of a situation where it was pretty dramatic and painful and scary. And I think a lot of people, when you have an impetus, a catalyst like that in your life, it does change you. I mean, there's lots of what we can talk about from facing our collective mortality over the last several years. And I've been really spending a lot of time in the research there around mortality salience and this idea that the brain, when it faces the sort of the finitude of their life, or that it is potentially shorter than we thought, which you get when you are in a pandemic, you think about your legacy. You think about what really matters. You change your behaviors, and we do it in conscious and subconscious ways. Sometimes it makes us uncertain, and you see that threat response. You see that in the polarization around political ideology. So facing your mortality can do that. But it also, in a lot of ways, creates these pro-social behaviors, these helping behaviors, and wanting to be better and different. And so I think that what we need to recognize is that happiness tends to be an offshoot of really hard times. Hardship kind of equals healing, depending on what type of personality you have going into those events. And so that's why it's like preventatively developing psychological fitness and actually practicing creating a resiliency in our mindset and being more altruistic and careful with people's feelings and kinder prevents you from having a bad reaction to a crisis. It actually makes it more likely that you'll take that crisis and do something better out of it. But all of that needs to be trained and adopted and thought of before the next crisis hits.
I want to give listeners a little bit of background about what you and your husband went through, which is that your husband was a professional athlete. He developed a very sudden and crippling illness. And a part of what you wrote the first book around is this idea that he was able to get through it successfully, in part because he went into it with a set of tools or a set of psychological attributes or a set of beliefs that made it possible for him to do that. And that's what you were just referring to when you said, we need to develop skills that can take us through hard times.
We want to establish, this is Kahneman's theory of heuristics, right? We want desire paths to be built in the brain where we're not practicing gratitude, we're grateful. And you have to work out psychological fitness to, in the moment, in those moments where you are reacting, kind of like Malcolm Gladwell talks about blink. We tend to react based on these heuristics, these patterns in our brain that we built through development and habit building and practice for many, many, many years. This is not, you do a 30-day gratitude journal and then all of a sudden, you get hit with something challenging and you're grateful for it. It's a pattern developed over time behavior that eventually becomes more innate. You develop a fluency in it. And then when you're struck with something really difficult, your natural innate response is to behave with those pattern heuristics, which are, I've practiced empathy. You practice cognitive empathy. It's a very difficult skill to build. Innate empathy is much easier to be able to leverage in a moment than cognitive empathy, but we can build it. It takes a lot of intentional effort. And so these are the types of work we need to be doing and practicing so that when we are faced with challenges, we just react in the way that our innate behavior is predicting. But that, again, like I said, it's like we don't realize the brain is a muscle. Like we would practice to run a marathon. If we were running an Ironman, it's years and years and years and years of training. And you sort of still have that innate genetic makeup that makes you more likely to win or succeed. So we need to take that innate and learned behavior and really develop it so that in our marathon moments, we can be successful.
It's really super interesting. It reminds me a little bit of something William James wrote. The quote from William James is, "Keep the faculty of effort alive in you by a little gratuitous exercise each day. That is, be systematically ascetic or heroic in little unnecessary points. Do every day or two something that, for no other reason, that you would rather not do it, so that when the hour of dire need draws nigh, it may find you not unnerved and untrained to stand the test." So the way he writes is it's so giant, right?
It is, yes. But it's so true.
I know.
I love William James.
Me
and
too.
Totally agree with this.
Yeah. And I'm sort of like, but I don't want to.
Especially right now, like I think about those moments where we go on social media and someone's being so frustrating and we just want to retaliate. It's like these are moments where we can take a pause of mindfulness in our brain and go, how do I even want to engage? Do I need to fuel anger and hate? What if someone's being a jerk to me on the road? Should I be chasing them down and yelling at them out the window? Or can I take a pause and think they're probably having a bad day? These are the kind of things that practice this cognitive empathy. So it's a lot of doing things right now that we don't want to be doing, like extending gratitude to someone who's being terrible to us. But I think that there is a way, like we have to take down the heat right now, that it's really hot. And so we do that by practicing these behaviors so that we can be part of just, again, like taking down the heat that we're all feeling, and that buzzing and that noise is making us feel extra stressed out right now.
But I'm going to come back because you say something more sophisticated, I think, than this. So he goes on to say, so with the man who has daily inured himself to the habits of concentrated attention, energetic volition, and self-denial in unnecessary things, he will stand like a tower when everything rocks around him and when his softer fellow mortals are winnowed like chaff in the blast. You really think he's been thinking, maybe he's been studying Abraham Lincoln's speeches or something when you read that?
Yeah, or Churchill.
Or Churchill, I know. But a lot of what you say in the book on happiness is it's not toughness. It's not macho-ness. It's not what he's saying, which is hit yourself with a rope. It's gratitude. That fundamentally developing a muscle around gratitude is one of the things that you can do to prepare yourself for hard times.
It's a focusing on what you have versus what you don't have mentality. And I like to practice selfishly what serves me. And what serves me is to not be angry. What serves me is to be forgiving. What serves me is to find people and humanity enjoyable and likable. And so I think we spend a lot of time thinking that we have a right to our feelings versus what is actually going to make us feel good, and getting stuck on that right or the justice of the feelings versus how do I want to spend most of my day? Do I want to spend it angry at the world because I have a right to? And I get that. Sometimes we don't have a choice because there's, especially for a lot of, our people in our population that are vulnerable or dealing with systemic poverty or constantly feeling like they are being layered on. And it's easy for me in a place of privilege as a, white middle class woman. But there are a lot of ways that I've seen people with a huge kind of what we would see as insurmountable barriers, and they somehow still look to the world with that hopefulness, and they are behaving in a way that still is optimistic. And they do that by realizing this feeling doesn't serve me. This anger doesn't serve me. It's not healthy for me. And it's a selfish thing to do in a way, but it's also selfless in that you are giving other people the ability to forgive themselves too, or to also feel happy and not to be meeting them with additional anger and hate that they're propagating. So it's a tool that if you look at it in this different shift of what it's actually doing for you, it's less about other people and it's more about how you're going to be empowered to your own experience of life.
Well, I want to bring this conversation now to the causes of burnout because it seems to me that understanding the causes of burnout is one of those things that might be a tool set for avoiding burnout. Now, a lot of this show is about how do we design work that is going to be better. And so I do approach from a design perspective, and I think that there's going to be, and you have in the book, a lot of suggestions about how to design the burnout out of systems. And there are a few places where you've gone particularly deep on particularly subtle challenges to understand. So let me read the causes, and then we're going to go through, I think, the ones that are trickiest to understand. Causes are 1, workload, just simple overwork. 2, perceived lack of control. 3 is lack of reward or recognition. 4 is poor relationships. The next is lack of fairness, and then values mismatch. Workload, think we understand. Perceived lack of control. Talk about the word perceived, because that could have just been lack of control. Is lack of control a mindset?
It can be both. You can actually not have control over the decisions that are being made inside your organizations. Your boss can be heavy-handed, your institution can be heavy-handed. And when we think of lack of control in the last several years, when we went through the pandemic, we were constantly anxiety fixing the pandemic as leaders, trying to say that we had solutions and felt obliged to have solutions for people, but we couldn't solve for a global pandemic, which was a really challenging thing for us. We did not actually have control. And there was also this cognitive dissonance that we had when we did the things we were doing inside of our workplaces. And then there was still other people that were making different decisions around protocols or, following rules and things like that. So there was a lot of sense of losing control. But then there's also perceived lack of control inside of organizations, which we see a lot, where there's feeling like you don't have autonomy in the way that you do your job. I feel like I have to follow a process. It's about a lot of compliance. And meanwhile, if I had autonomy or had the agency to be able to make some of the decisions about how I get to goals versus how many hours I've worked, then that will make me feel like I own this task, even though you might be doing the same tasks, you might be hitting the same goals, you're just doing it in your own way. And so giving people that perception that they are able to job craft and make decisions on their own terms changes the way that they feel about work entirely. And so what we see in micromanagers, for example, is that they don't allow that. They take away that ability to have autonomy and flexibility, which makes people feel very stressed out and unhappy, and they quit. And there's lots of ways that we can design that for people where we are allowing them to choose how they get over the finish line. We give them, this is what I expect from you by such and such a date, give a deadline. However way you get there, I don't care. However fast you finish it, I don't care. These are just the expectations. And I think the more autonomy we can provide, the less likely people are to burn out because they're innately connected to the value of the work. The activities in the work are theirs.
They are free to navigate through the parts that are most damaging to them, to navigate around those things. I also suspect, based on no research, that a delusion of agency is almost as good as actual agency.
What is, I think, so cool too about perception piece in the brain? I mean, we can feel psychologically safe just having a perception that we have people that will be there for us. If we think that there is a person that would bail us out of jail, or there's one person that'll pick us up from the airport, whether that's ever going to be tested or not, hopefully not the bailing out of jail piece. But if we just perceive that, we feel the same feelings of psychological safety as we would if that wasn't actually true, but our perception makes it true. And so I think that giving people the ability to perceive that, it's a win-win. I mean, employers are getting what they want. They're getting, the objective met, but they're allowing people to feel like it's their objective that they're meeting and it's internalized. And so this is how we need to be thinking more around how do we design environments where it isn't about relinquishing control, because that's that threat for people. I'm not going to be taken seriously. I'm not going to be authoritative. So I have to be in control. There's a level of expectation of stoicism that's still very much alive and present inside of organizations. But when we actually give people their autonomy, we end up having more control over the outcomes in the end, because we're just getting people to do the work at their best in their most productive times. We're leveraging their strengths, and they're working through some of the things at their own time that is maybe more challenging for them. And so for me, I think that lack of agency piece is a really big threat for burnout, especially right now in some of these arbitrary decisions that are happening around return to work 5 days a week. And, I want you to come into the office, you have to commute back in, and we're going to sit you on a Zoom call for 10 hours a day, exactly what you could be doing while working from home. These are the kind of things that people feel like I don't have any agency, and there's no reason why we're making these choices because they're not actually solving the problem.
Yeah. They're not supported by research. It's arbitrary. I don't have agency over it. Although it's surprising how many people are exerting agency in the face of the demand to return to work.
It's a rebellion, I think is happening a bit in some ways. They're revolution.
Yeah.
There is a pushback that we've never seen before from the workforce that has been interesting to watch.
One of my friends pointed out, you take a whole lot of really talented people and you put them into a situation that's impossible, they will figure a way out. There's actually, here in my town, there's an office for my company that I can't get into because it was an acquisition, but I can wave my badge in front of it. I don't exactly know how that shows up in the data, but I think it probably shows up as me going to work if I cared to not be open about my conformance to policy.
People work around dumb policy. And so you do it, or right now we're just saying, oh, we're not going to do it. And I think,
Right.
especially when you look at the fact, like I said, 30% of the workforce in the next 6 years is going to be Gen Zs. They do not have the same motivators. And so this is going to be a very interesting time. It's a good time to be in the research and understanding of workplace issues.
It is. That's true. Let's take the whole world and do an experiment on it. So you spoke about the importance of poor relationships as a cause of burnout. And one of the things that really impressed me in there, well, actually a couple of things. One is, thank you for unpacking some Gartner research, because most of us just sort of quote Gartner research like it's scripture because it supports our point, but we never dig into it. And so I thought that was super useful. But you also cited a lot of data that relationships and health are so closely tied. What is that relationship and how causal is it?
Well, even just the fact that Vivek Murthy has come out and the WHO now has started a commission on social connection, who I was just communicating with yesterday. I think that it's saying it's conversely, the loneliness epidemic, the loneliness problem is catastrophic to our health. I mean, when you look at the big, we've heard this a lot, the kind of statement that's caught on is loneliness is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day on our health and, long-term health. I mean, there's some huge implications to feeling lonely. And right now we're looking at, and I had this really great conversation with John Clifton, who's the CEO of Gallup, and we spent some time talking around the friendship piece and belonging piece. And he said that it's unbelievable how our relationships with people at work and specifically too have declined. We see that right now, only 3 in 10 people have a best friend at work, even though having a best friend at work actually helps you to have better stress reduction in the rest of your life. There's huge implications. Toxic workers, and I wrote in the book, if you have a toxic worker in your life, they actually reduce your lifespan. I mean, there's implications to toxicity in relationships at work. A best friend at work reduces your burnout by 41%. Huge impact there. Psychological safety increases roughly around 27%. If we have a friend at work, it's really tied both correlated negatively and conversely positively to our mental health when we have a friend or where we don't. One of the interesting things that John was saying was that there's this friendship recession that we're in, that it's getting worse. And
Friendship recession.
Which I think, is an interesting line. And he mentioned one data point that said of global population, 20% of people don't feel like they have a single person they can turn to. 1 in 5 people across the global population are feeling that disconnect. And so when we look at designing workplaces for belonging, we have to consider that this new hybrid and remote experience is playing a role, but that we don't curate culture and friendships and belonging by just bringing people back together in a place. We kind of forgotten that the office wasn't like this utopian experience pre-pandemic where like everyone was happy and we were all friends and it was just this joyful place of where everyone felt that they were connected and belonged. There was a real deficit pre-pandemic. And so the curation of belonging and friendships has to happen in all different types of ways, and making people feel valued, making them feel like the relationships that we're building are based on unique benefits, not just if you're competent or if you're accountable, which is what we're looking for in friendships these days, according to some really interesting research. So there's other ways that we need to be thinking about it. And it's kind of a radical acceptance approach versus let's just go back, because we're comparing it to something that wasn't really the best example of how to build friendships previously, but it's getting worse. And it's something that really needs to be addressed because people are feeling really unwell and really lonely.
Yeah, I love that phrase, friendship recession. I feel like a lot of things are stacking up to make that true. And you had a section in the book around how technology can mitigate it. I worked for Cisco Systems, and Cisco Systems is a video conferencing company. They have just the most beautiful video conferencing, and we all had it at home. And so my first thought is to sort of poo-poo the ability of technology to make human connection. But we found that $100,000 of video equipment added up to Whiskey Fridays, which was the people on the East Coast said, hey, let's get together, maybe 5 o'clock on Fridays and have a drink. And the people on the West Coast said, we can't start drinking at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And they said, how about 2:30? And everybody said, yeah, okay. And so
That's acceptable.
that's okay. We can do that. And so at 2:30, we were not drinking every Friday, but that's one of the first things that we found was most valuable about that technology was the ability to get together. And so I do believe that technology can play a part in it.
I do too. And I think that there's a way that we can utilize it, and how we were using it before was actually more effective because we were, using video conferencing for continuing learning, which was mostly what it was used for. And then some web conferencing. And, it wasn't just always on. And the fact that we've just increased this over collaboration, our meeting fatigue. I mean, Teams meetings alone went up 252% over the last several years. I mean, it's just astronomical, the amount of meeting fatigue. And so then the things that it's supposed to be used for, which is connection and collaboration, ends up being exhausting. And I love what Shopify did, where they just purged all of their meetings for 6 weeks. They just said no. And they made like one day where you'd have your meetings per week. And they ended up getting 325,000 hours back in just 6 weeks. And so I think that, if we want to use technology, we have to realize that it's in an overuse stage era right now. And to make it actually do what we're trying to do to solve for belonging and loneliness is to reduce the amount of time that we're using it for work.
That's interesting. Yeah. Number of hours face-to-face in meetings is not the same as connection.
Yes. And we're swapping that out. Oh, well, we're getting lots of time together. We go into the office. But I have had so many conversations with people saying they sit side by side in their offices and they're all on the same meeting because there's still people that are virtual. They're all on the same meetings, all on video conferencing technology all day. And they don't get up to have lunch together anymore. They don't drop by each other's desks, which is what we used to do. We'd have all meetings together in a room, and then maybe if there was a few people that were remote, we dialed them in. None of those behaviors are happening now. And that makes sense. We were isolated. We were told to avoid people. We have a massive increase in social anxiety that we've never seen before. Self-reported social anxiety went from around 4% to 37% of the population. So we have to massage that muscle and bring that back so that we're doing very intentional things about bringing people back together, because our brains are just subconsciously setting us up to be lonely.
I want to talk about values mismatch. It's such a squishy idea. And I guess what I mean is, what is a values mismatch? And I want to get into the idea of what even are values so that we can think about how to match them.
This for me has been so interesting because I feel like on the 6 root causes, the values mismatch kind of is like, oh, no one really checks that off when you ask. And I ask people a lot, when I'm doing my talks or when I'm researching, I'll say of these 6 root causes and I'll explain them. It's rare that people will say values and mismatch. It's almost always overwork. And then we'll maybe see the relationships piece or lack of fairness, but rarely values mismatch. And I think in this post-pandemic future of work that the values mismatch piece is the thing that has to be of the biggest strategic importance for leaders right now. And the reason why I say that is because through the last 3 years and this kind of conversion, like you talked about, like the piling on or the stacking up, the shift from people retiring and leaving work and the boomer exodus, Gen Zs moving in and expanding in the workforce. We're in a polycrisis state. There's people that collectively around the globe at the exact same time face their collective mortality. So you have mortality salience. Then you have a frame of reference. So the thing that people actually never would have thought they could have, they have. And now you're taking it back. So people have a frame of reference now of what it's like to pick up their kids at 3:00 in the afternoon. They have a frame of reference of what it's like not to commute for 2 hours and still be productive. So you've got this whole soup of things that have changed people's value systems, their belief in what they think is valuable. Our brains now query every single time we make a choice about what we're doing. Is this worth it? Which is why I read the book. Why are we here? They're asking, why are we here? Every single choice they're making. This is toxic. I don't like how I feel. I'm burning out. Why are we here? I'm a leader. I thought that I wanted to be the CEO, and now I realize I hate this job. We as leaders, why are we here? Everyone's asking that at the same time, because all of a sudden their values are ever present. What matters, and their values are less about identity with work and more about their identity with life and what they want to do with their lives. What are their deathbed regrets? They would have never thought about that, but for a global pandemic, forcing them to think about that every day. So from a value standpoint, leaders need to be designing around personalization, thinking about the employee as if they are the product that they're personalizing out to every single one of their customer. We need to be thinking that this single mom of 3 who's a Black woman who is a single income earner is going to have very different needs based on her values than a Gen Z 23 years old just going into work for the first time out of being in a university for 4 years alone and isolated and have no network. I mean, we need to think about personalizing the experience of well-being and wellness and happiness and burnout reduction, all of that with this mindset of values, and that they're so specific to each individual person, and designing strategies around that to create that personalization, that connection on one-to-one HR, one-to-one leadership is the only path that we're going to see to maintain people's attention, their engagement, their passion, their purpose. Because right now, that's all that matters to us are those values.
It's been one of my critiques of phrases like people want purpose, mastery, and autonomy, is that saying purpose doesn't say anything, because people's purposes are so different, their values are so different, and what meaning is for different people is so different, that it's not a design attribute of work to say purpose, because it's not specific enough to be used for design. A second critique is the idea that the purpose of the whole company is the purpose that we need to attach to. It's the purpose of the hour of work I'm doing right now. It's job specific, it's hour specific, and the idea that the whole mission of the company can be, this is my phrase actually, sprinkled like meaning dust over everybody's job.
Yes.
It's not specific enough.
This is so critical because we see this generationally too, where boomers did attach to the mission, to the purpose, and they would work towards organizational mission. And what you see more in millennials and Xers is more for their boss. Like they will work towards the leaders that they're attached to. Gen Zs, it's actually about greater global purpose. Like they're more interested in making sure that you're aligning with climate value and thinking about the environment in your organization as part of your CSR, or part of like what you think outside of the objective of the organization. It's like who you are, what you mean, what are your values. That's what Gen Zs are attracted to and younger millennials. So it's less about being excited about the widget that we're making. It's like, what gives you your sense of meaning? And for some people, it is a paycheck. For some people, it is, to provide for their family. They're not looking for that in work. And so sometimes we think a purpose has to be some sort of metaphysical objective. And for a lot of people, no, that's not it. And I feel really good about making money and providing for my family. So we can't decide for people anymore what the organizational purpose is. We need to be thinking around, how do you contribute in a way that's impactful, that matters? And that's what is generative from you and how you feel about it versus be proud of this, whatever shareholder value that we provided or this is the amount of revenue we made. People don't care about that in the same way, especially this new cohort that's coming in. You're just not connecting with them.
This is a perfect segue into my closing questions. I always ask at the end of each interview, what job do you hire your job to do for you? So your work hires you to do something for it. What do you hire it to do for you?
So I would hire it for positive impact. And positive impact for me isn't having to put a dent in the universe or, changing or being world changing. Actually, really don't like that now everyone says that their product is life changing. I think that making impact is in the small ways. That's a really important for me is in the kind of the daily things that we do that are slightly more focused on being human and increasing a sense of humanity in our world and doing things slightly different. So that's, I think, what workers do, the workforce does. And in many situations, they don't understand the impact that they're making. And every single person that does any sort of job in the formal or informal economy are impacting in a way that's helpful and productive and useful. And I think if more people felt that they were making an impact in a positive way in what they did, it would be beneficial.
In design, there's the idea of a detect, which is it tells you that your action has been completed. And the detect on this pen is that when I put on the cap, it goes, click, I know I'm done. Makes me happy. Do you have an adequate detect that shows you when what you're doing is working?
I wish I did. I think that having that click that says I've completed my job would feel very satisfying. And a lot of the work that I do is a long game, and a lot of what is going to come posthumously is going to be part of that long game. So I don't have a measure. I think that you have to design the measures yourself. You have to put in not boundaries around your work, but those click moments where you said, okay, I've done enough. And I find myself as a person prone to burnout because my passion goes from harmonious to obsessive. And then it gets into the dangerous territory of burnout. So, thinking, for example, I write my book. I could go back to that book 1,000 times and think, oh, that would have been a better word, or I could have done more here, or there was so much more I wanted to write because I missed all this because it was going out in the pandemic. I think a lot of us feel constantly unfinished, and we need to get better at being congratulatory and celebratory when we constantly hit milestones. And I also think too, for people that are like me and you, probably a lot of people out there that are kind of in that driven mindset, it's sort of never enough. And we always want to be on every single, in every sort of environment where we can make change. We've like got impact addiction, and you have to pull back on that because then you make less impact. It's just like a reverses your ability or your capacity.
We had Simone Stolzoff, who wrote The Good Enough Job, on the show. And one of the things that came out in that show is that he wanted to be a writer and he wanted to stop working for other people. And he did. And he's his own worst boss because he's a slave driver and he has no actual real good enough job in him. Right? It's so funny. So
True.
Last question. What does your job cost you?
It costs me many things. It costs me, my heart sometimes. It costs me my time. It also costs me my sense of, confidence in my abilities. And there's moments of imposter syndrome that a lot of people in our world share. It also costs, I guess, and then when you talk about cost, I look at it as like value, like what is the value that I get out of it? But there's a lot of cost in that, I have to be very careful all the time of knowing that I'm part of a large workforce. I'm one of many that I feel like I am part of being a representative of, or I'm not leading, but I'm leading the conversation around certain aspects that make me want to stand up for it. And so sometimes that costs me my sense of capacity. But if I would say on a lighter note, for me, all of those things feel highly valuable. It feels extremely valuable for me. I feel like that I wouldn't want to change anything, even when I have gone through burnout and when I go through moments where I feel like, oh, what's the point? Nothing's going to change. It's getting worse. It can cost me my optimism sometimes. Like, I'm doing all of this. I've been writing about happiness, working on burnout prevention, and people are more burnout than I've ever seen them before in my life. It's getting worse. I think that the feeling of actually doing something is extremely rewarding. And I tell people, yeah, you can love your job and still work a day in your life. That myth of love what you do, never work a day in your life is a total myth. And I think that you can love what you do and work really hard, but it's a different feeling that you have when you feel that engagement in your job. And it's what I think I'm fighting for people at work, not to think that leaders are doing a terrible job. Here's how you increase value and all those other things because it's good for productivity or it's good because we make a lot of money and, there's all these health benefits. It's like, no, I want to give every single person that goes to work in a day to feel a sense of joy. We have 90,000 hours we spend at work in our life. 50% of our waking hours is at work. And the fact that the majority of the global workforce are unhappy at work is very sad for me. So that goal, even though it's hard to chase, it's a fulfilling goal because it does feel amazing to love your job.
Where can listeners learn more about you and your work?
They can go to my website, jennifer-moss.com. I'm on the socials. Not really. LinkedIn, really, mostly. I'm not really great at some of the other places, but people can go to the website. And I'm always happy, like in LinkedIn, for example, of that's how we connected. But I always like talking to people there. And I'm very open to connecting and chatting. And I'm not kind of have to be a 6 degrees of separation from people that are interested in the work. I like to chat with people and answer questions on research and new ideas and explore that with people.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. It's been delightful. And thank you for the books. I loved reading them.
I'm so glad we got to have this conversation. So glad. And I'll make sure I send you a pre-copy of the next one that comes out so you can have a read and tell me what you think.
I'm really interested in that book, and you'll have to come back on so we can talk about it.
I'd love that. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.